Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching today's long-range forecast video brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. This analysis is being provided for perspective only, and any decision made based upon this presentation is the sole responsibility of the person making the decision. Finally, please remember that all long-range weather forecasting is speculative by nature. We're going to begin in South America in this video, and the animation you're watching in the background here shows precipitation all across the globe over the last week, but I want your attention down here in South America. Specifically, we have a question to answer at the beginning of this video, which is there anything that will be changing the strength of the Brazilian monsoon? We want to describe that monsoon and explain how things are changing in the near term and what might be the more dominant controls on it. Because as you can see right in through this central section of Brazil, the monsoonal circulation is quite healthy and it's been producing regular daily rainfall amounts as it would normally do. We've had very frequent low pressure systems that have come through Argentina as well as of late. So let's focus on South America as we get this all started. Now, a couple of notes about what's been going on. Let's talk about the soybean harvest. It's about 30% completed. They're below what they were a year ago, but remember last year was one of the fastest plantings of soybeans we've had on record. So they're much closer this year to the 5-year average. In Mato Grosso, which is kind of the largest producing state down here in Brazil, 60% of the beans have been harvested. About 63% of the safrinha corn's been planted. That's below a year ago, but still about 10% above normal on the average, and they're anticipating a very large corn crop, which is quite well understood and known right now. In Paraná, getting down a little bit farther to the south down here, they had some early season stress on some full season corn, but remember, better than 70% of Brazil's corn crop is a safrinha crop or a second crop, so there hasn't been much of a reaction to some of the less than stellar yields in parts of Paraná. And we're going to talk about Argentina in just a few moments. They're going to show up dry in the near-term forecast, but remember, just in the recent few days, they had some pretty big thunderstorms that rolled through there, adding quite a bit of rainfall. Also, some of the early estimates were just increased by 1 to 1.5 million metric ton for both crops, corn and soybean. So with that as a backdrop, I want to show you some research I've been doing specifically about Mato Grosso. And we're looking here at the change over the last 70 years in the precipitation rate for Mato Grosso. And there's a pretty clear signal in the long-term data set in that over that time period, March has been becoming a wetter and wetter month since 1940s, as you can see here in this information. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to pluck out those Marches that were really dry and the Marches that were really wet and try to understand what made them wet or dry, because as we look forward in this forecast, that will be critical for this next crop that's going in. So if we look at the behavior of the Brazilian monsoon when we have wetter than average conditions, we have almost this low-level transport of quite a bit of moisture that comes out of the tropics here, and it comes in just like this, okay? Very warm sea surface temperatures in this area bring in that, on those trade winds, this wind that curls around the Amazon, which again adds more moisture to it. Remember, there's a large mountain chain that runs right in through here, and what happens is that moisture kind of turns around in this direction, running along what's called this low-level jet that sits down here over Bolivia and into Paraguay. Now, frequent low-pressure systems that come sweeping here across Argentina will leave in their wake high-pressure cells, and the flow around that high pressure ends up creating right in this area, right in through here, excellent surface low-level convergence. And that just means the air rises, okay? Frequent thunderstorms inside that corridor, which is what makes this particular ground so agriculturally productive during the time period when the Brazilian monsoon is strongest. Now, the monsoon is normally losing strength as we go through the month of March into April. That's the normal end of its cycle. But remember, this is all tropically driven. This has nothing to do with upper-level troughs and ridges like we often talk about over North America. We're in the tropics here. Here's the other thing I want to point out. When all of this is happening, there is great upper-level support deep in the atmosphere where we have what's called negative velocity potential sitting over this region. And all that means is the upper levels are doing nothing to suppress this motion. And I want you to keep an eye on that as I move forward in this forecast. Now, certainly over the next week, you're looking at a map of precipitable water. We see the trade winds transporting that moisture in and around, telling us that the monsoonal circulation in through here is alive and healthy and well and doing its normal thing. Drier than average conditions down in Argentina, not necessarily a problem given how much precipitation we just had. But I want to take you to the upper levels and start discussing this. So this is the 19th of February through the 4th of March. And on this Hav-Mueller diagram, we're going to look right here above South America. So I'm just going to draw a couple of guiding lines to keep us in place here. Now, wherever you see these colors, this is good upper level support for precipitation and the strength of the monsoon, and this would be suppressing motion. We can see that through at least the next week. If I just kind of highlight this area, the upper levels of the atmosphere are helping with the development of precipitation and excellent support in the strength of the monsoon. But then we tend to go over toward a drier time period as we get out here past the end of February and to start March. But if you could draw lines that kind of flow with time on how things are changing, it appears that there is a cyclical behavior right now in these upper level wind fields, these low amplitude waves that we pay so close attention to. Therefore, I don't feel as though the tropics are completely stuck in one configuration like they were back in August, September, October, November, December with the Indian Ocean dipole. Okay? I think that the tropics are moving through their normal cycles at this time of year. So what does that mean? That means over the next week, with the monsoon going, wetter than average conditions here, drier in Argentina. And remember, the drier weather that you see in Argentina, not a problem given how much rain they just recently saw. So not a ubiquitous problem for everybody. But if you look into week 2, well, remember, this is when the upper levels of the atmosphere begin to suppress some of the motion over this area. We start to see some drier conditions with just around the periphery with some of that remnant moisture. We see things showing up on the wetter side of things. I am starting at this point to get concerned that the models have not yet returned moisture back to Argentina at this point. So we may start to think about Argentina having some problems as they're finishing out and letting some of the first crop mature at this point. From there, let's go back to this idea of some upper level support. Now, normally when we think about these low amplitude waves moving across the tropics, we're focused on the MJO. And just a reminder, from November through March, when we are in phase 4, 5, and 6 in the MJO, that tends to be more suppressive of upper level motion over Brazil's main growing regions. But this year things were off a little bit, because if you go back to January, this time period right in through here, kind of highlighting with the black marker here, during that time period, we were only suppressing vertical motion in Brazil's eastern growing areas and not so much in their central and southern growing areas. So this isn't a slam dunk on the forecast. And where things are going right now is the MJO is currently sitting here straddling phase 5 and 6, but at low amplitude, and is forecast to end up back in the null phase, which means the tropics right now are not advertising any sort of long-range predictability, especially when it comes to the Madden-Julian oscillation. So I kind of bring this part of the discussion to this conclusion. Over the next 15 days, a lot of the rain that we see here is primarily coming in week 1, with week 2 being drier. Now I want you to look at this and see that if you go south of Hawaii in this little area through here, things are looking very wet. Northern Australia is looking wet, and just south of India is looking very wet. So looking at those really dry marches, what would this global precipitation pattern need to look like? And this is where the signals do start to get crossed up. You see, for those marches, that were very dry, okay, in Brazil, this region in through here was quite wet. And that's very similar to what we have right now. See it? Secondly, it was very wet north of Australia, but it was very dry south of India, which means we have two things, should they continue, primarily this region in through here, where we are dealing with this wedge of wetter conditions, and northern Australia, that if those two things continue, I would expect this region in Brazil to begin to dry out into the month of March, especially southern and western Brazil growing regions. But the tropics right now are not advertising a very clear signal. So here's what we end up getting. In those same dry marches, we also tended to get a very El Nino-like behavior in the atmosphere, primarily upward rising motion here, just off of the coast of Peru, with sinking motion in the atmosphere here. So that particular configuration tended to dry out much of Brazil's major growing area. And I guess what I'm trying to tell you right now is the tropics are not advertising any of this strongly one way or the other. And as a consequence, predictability is very, very low right now for South America, which means we're going to watch it a week to 2 weeks at a time. Here are my major conclusions. First statement is one I just said. The tropics are exhibiting very weak teleconnection to Brazilian monsoonal precipitation. We don't have an El Nino or a La Nina any sort of reaction in the tropics to say that there would be. And with the Madden-Julian oscillation going to the null phase, that removes another layer of predictability. So that's why I say in this second statement, long-range predictability is very low. We know that the trend for March precipitation over the last 7 years is up, which means this area and through here has been getting wetter and wetter and wetter, and that's Brazil's most dominant producing state. The European weeklies, they've performed very poorly down here in Argentina. But what I've been drawing on over here on the right is the latest European weekly forecast that goes out for the entire month of March. And right now, if I get those drawings off there, they've painted this corridor as showing up wet, with southern Brazil's growing area showing dry and Argentina showing dry. But I have very little confidence in it. And the reason why is because of its poorer performance over the last month or so. And just remember, the European model here is probably our best performing global model that we have. So what I would like for you all to do is, knowing the statistics we just covered at the beginning of this video, we need to remember that moving forward, we need to watch Brazil daily to see if any sort of pattern change occurs that could possibly impact the strength of the monsoon as it wanes throughout the month of March into April. All right, those are the main conclusions I have at this point. So from there, let's turn our attention to the United States. I apologize, but we've had a data drop out here from NOAA in this area for the whole of this week, so please ignore that region. But I want you to see that the pattern we've had so far year to date has featured split flow, and the split flow is best seen over here in the map that is on the left. So from the 1st of January through the 16th of February, we've had a trough sitting over Alaska. We've had a ridge to its south blocking things up. The flow has come right in like this into the Pacific Northwest. In fact, let me redraw that arrow so it's a little clearer. Into the Pacific Northwest. Then the split flows come around the bottom side of this and run right up over this ridge before creating these big low pressure systems south of Greenland. The ridge that's been sitting over here has allowed for an early arrival to spring, but also some extremely wet conditions in parts of the southeast and mid-south. This pattern has avoided California, as we've talked about so much. We needed to see that setup because of where we're going. Through the end of this week, what we end up getting is very similar configuration. Our big ridge isn't through here. What I circled was the first trough over Alaska and the bigger trough that's been sitting in and around Greenland for quite some time. You can see the tail end of that has come down here through the East Coast, which is why we've seen some cooler weather behind this as we finish out this week. So this ridge you see here is not warming things up. We've got some cooler weather that is behind this on higher atmospheric pressure. As we get into next week, the trough that was sitting over Alaska then dives into the Four Corner states, and as it emerges in the central U.S., it will produce at least 2 low-pressure systems that I'm watching here that'll go across the middle part of the United States. But the big question is, as we look longer term, is there anything that's going to shut down this precipitation pattern? Because what we've seen is the split flow taking a lot of precipitation up into this area on the nose of that ridge, and the subtropical jet stream coming in like that with the flow meeting up with it from the north here. So we can see that over the next week, very wet conditions, as we detailed several times this week, happening down here from eastern Texas all the way to North Carolina. And we do need to watch out next week for systems to develop here and push toward the north and east, even adding more rain to the really wet areas. But this is a pattern that has missed California and kept things quite dry there. So to show you some of those details, I just want to play out for you the operational European model. As we play this forward, at the end of this week, we still see the lingering frontal boundary Wednesday into Thursday hanging out down there in the south, and that's what's going to keep things wet along the south. We do have to be on the lookout Thursday for some snow to possibly fall in Tennessee, getting over to the Appalachian Mountains, maybe in North Carolina. I'll show you the probabilities in a moment. But behind this big area of high pressure comes in. You can see it sitting right over there, Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma. That's the cool finish to this week, and that high slowly slides off the East Coast by the start of next week. At that point, that trough is dug down here into the midsection of the United States, and as it does that, it's going to create another low that's going to start in Oklahoma, and it appears early next week run straight through the southern tip of Illinois over into Tennessee, Kentucky. So this active pattern is still on for a while, and you can see a second low that comes in behind it midweek next week. So that takes you out 1 full week in this forecast. So not much changing the pattern in the near term, although I don't quite see the same magnitude of some of the big systems we had over the last couple of weeks. Told you I want to show you where the snow probabilities are looking the highest. This is the probability through all the way through next Wednesday morning getting at least 3 inches. So the current system exiting at the end of the week maybe has a chance at putting down some snow here in Tennessee and North Carolina. But then with the systems that are coming out, they're going to hammer here the central and northern Rockies. possibly quite a bit of snow here on the Front Range in Colorado, and then the main corridor of the chance for snow stretches from that region through here into parts of eastern Canada. So that seems to be the same trajectory, and you can see how we are still missing California on this pattern. Okay, any shot at cold air that we do have coming in after this, because look at the way the pattern is going to evolve here. By the beginning of March, this ridge fully noses here into British Columbia. That's going to displace the trough that was sitting over Alaska and push it into the Bering Sea, yet no major change in the troughing that has been happening over Greenland and even eventually over towards Scandinavia. So the cold air that comes in into this position does a couple of things. First of all, it's going to dry things out into week 2, so fully into week 2, so next Wednesday and beyond for much of the middle part of the United States. But it's going to bring in some cooler weather. There is some hope that this could increase precipitation amounts in California over what they have been as of late, but you're still going to see a drier bias until this pattern fully evolves into what we need for California. The cooler weather that is coming in, though, is not anchored to a disruption in the polar vortex. Polar vortex through the next 10 days is looking quite strong, and we're almost too far into the winter season for the polar vortex disruption to have an impact anyway. So if we just look out into week 2, we still have the split, which is why the west coast is going over toward dry. But with that broader trough sitting in through here, the wetter weather stretches off the coast. We do get some drier conditions that come into some folks that absolutely need it as we look out from like the 27th through the 3rd of March. Okay, that's what this week 2 pattern is shaping up to be. But to finish this up, I want to talk long term. So over the next 5 days, yep, we have a cool bias that occupies a big section of the United States here, and certainly here in this part of the Rockies. But we're going to have to watch Alaska to see the change in the temperature patterns. You see, as the ridge slowly starts to nose in at the end of the month, that's when we start to displace this cooler air in here, following the spine of the Rocky Mountains, but then getting out into the Central Plains and into the Midwest, such that by days 10 through 15, we've now pushed the ridge into this area, and now we let the trough that extends from Greenland occupy this whole region, and therefore it's drier, okay, because we're on the convergent side of the trough, but we could go over to some cooler weather as we get into the first full week of March. Now, beyond that, let me take you now to March 3rd through the 10th. At that time period, the models are hanging on to this ridge feature that is south of the Aleutian Islands. And therefore, the main trough, which will be sitting here almost over the North Pole, will have an extension that will basically go right here through much of the United States. This is a significant pattern change, especially over Alaska, as to what we've seen so far this year, which is where the ridge has been back farther here and not so much like this, with a trough that's been sitting over Alaska here and a dominant ridge. So the big change as we get into March, I'll put an X in it, is the breaking down of that ridge. Question is, does that last? I noticed that as I go all the way out here to the end of March, so this is the 18th to the 25th in the European weeklies, we see our ridge backing up a little bit, more of a trough establishing itself here a little bit farther to the west, and this is trying to drop another trough here and allow the ridging action to maybe rebound over Cuba. And if that happens, the subtropical branch of the jet stream comes cranking through. The flow ends up splitting like this over and around in the upper levels, the polar jet stream, and we kind of go back over to what we've had recently. So that's why when we look out for the entirety of the month of March, we still see the split flow out here with the ridge pushing into British Columbia. We still see the influence of the subtropical jet stream, but possibly a drier pattern overall in the midsection of the United States where we do have an excess amount of moisture. I'm not sold on this right now. What I'll tell you is the cooler anomalies we see in the mountains is more than likely due to the excess of snow we have in the Intermountain West, not in the Sierra Nevada, but in the Intermountain West. And we've seen kind of a systematic cooling here over the southeast as we move into the month of March, as we change things up over Alaska, which is the main story we just kind of carried throughout this video. So we need to be watching this pattern carefully because this region especially, which has been very wet as of late, looks to get a kind of a near-term drying after we finish the next 7 to 8 days. So drying as we start the month of March, but maybe cranking back up toward the end of it. I'm going to have to watch that very carefully. Whereas the European models perform very poorly in parts of South America, it has done very well with its long-range forecasts across much of North America with the precipitation patterns specifically. And I'm mainly targeting this area right in through here, okay? So I want to show you this, though, as we finish up this video. If we compare what we've got this year to the same time period a year ago, there are differences, big differences. And the big one is right here. That is the most critical piece of information combined with what's happening over Greenland that is a major change from this year to last year. So the big questions about what spring might look like, well, I'll tell you this, the beginning of this year is not looking at all like it did a year ago in terms of the flow of the atmosphere. And I can continue this. This is now looking at March of a year ago March of a year ago and May of a year ago. You see, we continue to see troughing setting up here off the west coast that then moved over the southwest, setting up an extremely active central United States to eastern United States weather pattern. This particular year, we are missing this feature, and California misses it more than any of us because that's the feature that tends to bring in all of the excessive moisture that we really, really need to be able to get. So we need that feature to change for California, but we don't need it to change for the rest of the United States when it comes to dealing with an excessively wet spring. So that is kind of the analysis and the things I want all of you to be watching with me. I hope you found the video informative, and I look forward to talking again tomorrow morning with our new near-term forecast, and we'll take another look at South America too. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you again in the morning. Thank you.